So I want you to just take a second and imagine a place that is basically, geographically speaking, in a constant state of fighting for its own survival.
Right. Yeah.
Like a relatively small waterlogged patch of land in Europe where the people are, constantly battling just to keep the North Sea from completely swallowing their homes.
Yeah, literally pumping water out just to have ground to stand on.
Exactly. And now I want you to imagine that this same small, precarious little nation somehow managed to project this outsized, almost unbelievable level of power across the entire globe.
It's kind of wild to think about.
It really is. I mean, we're talking about influence stretching from like the shores of Indonesia and the isolated ports of Japan all the way across the oceans to the Caribbean and North America. And the question is, how do you pull that off?
Right, because they definitely didn't do it the traditional way.
No, not at all. They didn't do it with some massive, endless army conquering continent after continent. They did it with, well, a fleet of ships, and just this ruthlessly efficient system.
Which is honestly one of the most fascinating paradoxes in all of history. I mean, you have this geography that suggests immense vulnerability, right?
Right.
But it somehow became the launch pad for one of the most expansive and intricate networks humanity had ever seen up to that point.
And that right there is the core of what we are unpacking in this deep dive today. We're looking at this really incredible stack of notes titled Kenny Dutch Empire.
Mm.
And they're organized around this very specific analytical framework called the Kenny lens.
Yeah, and for those of you joining us, this isn't going to be about, just memorizing dates or tracing lines on a map.
No, thank goodness.
Right. The Kenny framework evaluates history through these concepts of system building, the mechanics of logistics, and this is the big one, the extreme tension between operational efficiency and ethical integrity.
Yeah, that tension is huge.
It is. The lens is vital here because it asks us to look at these historical figures not as traditional kings or heroes or, mountains, but as system operators.
Yeah.
It totally changes the fundamental question we ask about the past.
Right, so the mission of our deep dive today is to really answer this massive question. What happens when power scales globally?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to explore how the Dutch essentially prototype modern global capitalism and like corporate governance. We'll look at the sheer undeniable brilliance of their logistics. But we are also, we're going to look directly at the devastating human cost required to achieve that level of optimization.
Yeah. We are essentially examining this 400-year-old blueprint for global connectivity. And, the really uncomfortable truth we're going to uncover is that in a lot of ways, the modern world is still operating inside the architecture of that exact blueprint.
I mean, that is just, it's a lot to wrap your head around. But okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with the physical reality of this empire, because we usually think of empires as these like giant blobs of color spreading across a map.
Right, the traditional empire model.
Yeah, you picture Rome, or later the British Empire, just consuming endless land masses, turning the map red or purple or whatever. But the material we're looking at suggests the Dutch approach was entirely different. They didn't want the whole map. They just wanted the toll booths.
That conceptual shift is basically everything. And it begins with their domestic geography, like you mentioned at the start.
The waterlogged nation.
Exactly. The Netherlands sits right on the North Sea, perfectly positioned at the mouths of these major European rivers. Their entire domestic landscape was shaped by water management.
Right.
They had to engineer ports, dig canals, and build dikes, literally just to survive the tides.
So keeping their feet dry basically forced them to become this culture of hyper-practical engineering.
Yes. And that domestic survival mechanism, it translated flawlessly into international maritime dominance. They developed what the Kenny framework calls a networked geography.
Okay, a networked geography. What does that mean in practice?
Well, if you look at the Spanish Empire during this era, their power was derived from vast inland territories, right? Like continental conquest in the Americas.
So they were extracting wealth from just massive chunks of land.
Exactly. The Dutch power, on the other hand, came from holding very specific, highly strategic points. We're talking ports, islands, forts, harbors, and choke points.
Okay, so if the Spanish Empire was like buying up thousands of acres of physical real estate to build these giant estates, the Dutch Empire was more like buying the Wi-Fi routers and laying the internet cables.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. Like they didn't need to own the massive house. They just needed to control the connections that allowed the house to communicate with the rest of the world.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. They basically owned the bandwidth of the 17th century.
Wow.
Yeah. In Asia, they established Batavia, which is modern-day Jakarta, as this massive central node. Over in the Atlantic, they developed Curaçao, Suriname, and New Netherland as commercial hubs.
All these really specific points.
Exactly. And along the African coast, they held strategic forts. They knew they lacked the raw territorial scale of their imperial rivals, so they just had to rely on extreme mobility and positioning.
But like holding a bunch of scattered routers and cables requires a totally different management style than ruling a massive continuous piece of land.
Totally.
You can't just have a king sitting in a throne room in Amsterdam issuing royal decrees that take, what, a year to reach a tiny island in Indonesia?
Right. The logistics of that just do not work.
No. So a networked empire demands an entirely new vehicle for projecting power.
Which brings us to this really monumental shift in global history, the invention of corporate imperialism.
Corporate imperialism?
Yeah, because remember, the Dutch Republic had won its independence from Spain, meaning they were a republic of provinces. They did not have an absolute monarch to fund and direct imperial fleets.
Right, no king to just tax the peasants and build a navy.
Exactly. So they created a workaround. They outsourced their imperial expansion to state-backed corporations.
The famous ones, right? The Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, and the Dutch West India Company, the WIC.
Yes. And the critical mechanism here, the really wild part, is that these corporations were delegated sovereign powers.
Okay, I really want to pause and drill down into that term, sovereign powers.
It's heavy.
Because today, if a major tech conglomerate or like a massive global shipping company had its own private military,
Right.
if they had the legal authority to sign peace treaties with foreign nations, declare war, and mint their own currency, we would call that a cyberpunk dystopia.
We absolutely would. It sounds like a sci-fi movie.
Yeah. So how does a republic legally and structurally justify handing the powers of a nation-state over to a board of shareholders?
Well, they did it through a legal framework that deliberately blurred the lines between state security and commercial enterprise.
Okay.
The state granted the VOC a monopoly on trade in Asia, but the state didn't want to pay for the massive naval protection required to actually maintain that monopoly.
Of course not. That's expensive.
Exactly. So the charter essentially said, you have the monopoly, but you must defend it yourself. And to defend it, you need an army. To pay for the army, you need massive capital. And to raise that capital, you sell shares to the public.
Wait. So the authority to commit violence was literally crowdfunded by the citizens of the Republic.
That is exactly what happened.
That is insane. So the liability and the risk were distributed among everyday investors, while the state just provided the legal cover.
Yep. And they justified it all through the language of, securing trade and maintaining order.
Maintaining order.
Right. But the analysis points out that this quote-unquote order was enforced through deeply unequal arrangements. They would form contracts and alliances with local rulers, sure, but those contracts were always backed by the threat of corporate military coercion.
So it wasn't really a partnership.
No, it was a strict hierarchy dressed up as a commercial partnership.
Which means we need to look at the engine of this corporate machine. Because to understand why a society would justify this level of outsourced, privatized power, you have to look at the immense, almost unfathomable wealth it was designed to extract. And frankly, the human fuel required to run it.
Yeah, and the lifeblood of this networked empire was long-distance trade, finance, and absolute commodity control. We are talking about a massive flow of goods. Spices from the Indonesian archipelago, textiles from India, and sugar and coffee from plantation colonies in the Atlantic.
And the brilliance of their system, if we're just looking at it logistically, wasn't just in the sailing, right? It was the invisible infrastructure they built around it.
Oh, absolutely.
The notes detail how they developed early maritime insurance just to mitigate the sheer risk of losing ships at sea.
Yeah, spreading the risk.
Right. And they coordinated these complex overlapping shipping routes so ships were rarely sailing empty. They built massive warehouse infrastructure in Amsterdam to stockpile goods.
Which was a huge advantage.
Because it allowed them to control the supply and manipulate prices across all of Europe, right?
Exactly. They mastered what's called the re-export network. They would bring goods from Asia to Amsterdam, warehouse them, and then sell them across Europe at a massive premium.
Just skimming profit off the top at every step.
Right. But the Kenny framework, it forces us to look at the dark underbelly of this logistical genius. This economic brilliance cannot be separated from what built it. And it was built directly on monopoly violence, colonial subordination, and the Atlantic slave trade.
And this is where the modern language of business becomes highly, highly problematic.
Yeah, it really does.
Because we read words in these notes like monopoly, logistics, and systemization. And in a modern context, those words sound sterile.
Clean.
Yeah, clean, like an administrative hurdle. Oh, we have a logistics issue. But in the 17th century, enforcing a monopoly didn't mean filing a lawsuit in a corporate court against a rival.
No, not at all.
It meant deploying a mercenary army to burn down a competitor's port, or displacing an entire population to ensure no one else could access a specific crop. I mean, are we too comfortable letting the language of efficiency mask the reality of the violence?
I think we are. The language is a shield. It sanitizes the historical reality.
Yeah.
For example, the notes explicitly point out that the WIC turned the island of Curacao into a major slave trade entrepot.
Wow.
It wasn't just a trading post, it was a highly optimized logistical hub for human trafficking.
Which is just horrific.
It is. And Suriname was developed as a brutal plantation colony entirely dependent on coerced labor just to feed the European demand for sugar and coffee.
The cognitive dissonance is just staggering.
Yeah.
The exact same highly optimized system that brought exotic spices, beautiful porcelain, and just unprecedented wealth to the merchants strolling along the canals of Amsterdam. That same system was simultaneously causing absolute devastation to communities across the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans.
The ledger hid the extraction. It really did. And that hyper-efficient, data-driven approach to viewing the world, it didn't just stay in the ledgers of the VOC.
Right. It leaked out.
It permeated their entire culture. It totally rewired how they viewed their place in the universe.
Which brings us to their mentality, the mindset of control. Because to understand how they justified this to themselves, we really have to look at who they were domestically. The Dutch Republic was deeply Protestant, right? Shaped by the Reformation and this brutal, decades-long war for independence against Catholic Spain.
Yes, the 80 Years' War. That conflict forged a civic identity where commerce, discipline, and practical problem-solving were viewed as ultimate virtues.
Okay.
But when they expanded overseas, their approach was fundamentally different from the Spanish or the Portuguese. The Iberian empires were deeply driven by a missionary zeal.
Right. They wanted to convert people.
Exactly. A core part of their imperial mission was converting indigenous populations to Catholicism.
But the Dutch sources indicate that trade almost always trumped theology for them.
Oh, absolutely.
They were commercially driven, incredibly pragmatic. It's like they didn't really care what God you prayed to, as long as you signed the exclusive trade contract.
Yeah, but we have to be careful here. We cannot mistake a lack of missionary zeal for cultural neutrality.
Oh, that's a good point.
Their pragmatic worldview was still steeped in an unshakable assumption of European and specifically Dutch superiority. They treated the entire globe as a raw resource, just something to be mapped, categorized, controlled, and ultimately monetized for their own benefit.
Monetized, yeah. And the primary tool for that control wasn't the sword, right? It was the map.
Yes.
The archival records mentioned in the material are incredibly revealing on this point. The National Archives show that Dutch cartography wasn't just about, figuring out how to get a ship from point A to point B.
Right, they weren't just navigational aids. The maps were instruments of administration and warfare. They were used to establish boundaries, claim resources, and enforce these monopolies. The level of detail in Dutch maps allowed them to coordinate complex logistics across vast distances in a way no other empire could match at the time.
It feels incredibly modern, actually. Like they were acting like the original data brokers.
They really were.
They didn't just move physical cargo. They tracked, logged, mapped, and categorized every single data point they could find. The overarching philosophy just seems to be, if you can map it, you can monetize it.
Yes. And you see this exact mentality reflected in the high art of the period, the famous Dutch Golden Age.
Oh, the still life paintings.
Exactly. Think about those incredibly detailed, hyper-realistic paintings.
Yeah, where there's like a canvas showing a half-peeled lemon, some exotic spices, maybe a silver cup, and imported Chinese porcelain just resting on a rich textile.
Right. They are gorgeous, obviously.
Stunning.
But when you look at them through this Kenny lens, they are basically corporate propaganda.
For propaganda, wow.
Yeah. They are material displays of global abundance. They are visually celebrating the success of the system, while entirely omitting the violence and coerced labor required to actually place that lemon and that porcelain on a table in Amsterdam.
It's just the aesthetic celebration of a perfectly functioning extraction machine.
Exactly.
But, a machine that turns human lives and distant ecosystems into, like, data points on a map.
Yeah.
that requires very specific types of people to run it.
It does.
People who prioritize the blueprint and the profit margin over human empathy.
Which brings us to what I think is the most fascinating part of the notes, the system operators. This is where the author deploys the Kenny subpersonality framework to actually analyze the people who ran this empire.
Right, let's get into this.
Yeah.
Because the framework intentionally discards the traditional hero versus villain narrative, doesn't it?
It does. Instead, it judges these historical figures strictly as system actors operating within a complex machine.
Okay, let's break down these figures because they illustrate exactly how this corporate behemoth functioned. We start with Jan Peter Zoon Cohn. And the framework labels him the architect of control.
Yes. Cohn was a governor general of the VOC, and he is really the central figure in cementing Dutch dominance in Southeast Asia.
Okay.
He's the one who founded Batavia, turning it into the administrative heart of the Asian network. But, I mean, his methods were just chillingly calculated.
The most glaring example in the notes is the 1621 Banda Islands massacre.
Right.
The local population in the Banda Islands resisted the VOC's attempt to enforce a total absolute monopoly on nutmeg. And Cohn's response wasn't, negotiation.
No.
It was the deployment of military force to systematically massacre and displace the entire population, replacing them with enslaved labor just to secure the supply chain.
It's brutal.
Okay.
And through the Kenny analysis, Cohn represents pure system efficiency operating completely devoid of ethical restraint.
Yeah, just numbers on a page to him.
Exactly. He looked at a logistical problem, a leak in the nutmeg monopoly, and he solved it with maximum brutal efficiency. He optimized the outcome for the shareholders, but the human cost was catastrophic.
He is basically what happens when a system values profit above literally all else.
Yes. And then you have a totally different type of operator, Pete Hine. The framework calls him the naval disruptor.
The naval disruptor, okay.
Hine is an interesting contrast because he wasn't building the administrative architecture like Cohn was.
Right.
He was a tactical operator who specialized in exploiting the weaknesses of rival systems. And his most famous achievement was the capture of the Spanish silver fleet in 1628.
Okay, wait. How does one even capture an entire imperial silver fleet? That sounds impossible.
Right. It was through immense tactical precision and logistical ambush. He basically intercepted the fleet near Cuba, cornered them, and seized an unimaginable fortune in silver without losing a single ship.
Without losing a single ship.
Yeah, and this massive influx of capital funded the Dutch Republic's military and paid out huge dividends to WIC shareholders.
Which is why, in traditional Dutch history, he's celebrated as this sort of folk hero.
Oh, absolutely.
The ultimate underdog striking a blow against the massive, evil Spanish Empire. But the Kenny lens strips all of that romanticism away.
It does.
It views him simply as a highly effective operator executing within a competitive system. Like, he wasn't questioning the morality of imperial wealth extraction. He was just exceptionally talented at playing the game.
Exactly. He was just the guy who stole the wealth from the other guys who stole it first.
Right, exactly. Now, moving to the political sphere, we have Johan de Witt, categorized as the Republican strategist.
Yes. De Witt was the leading political figure of the Dutch Republic during its economic zenith, and his role was entirely different from Cohen or Hine.
Because he was back home.
Right.
Yeah.
He had to maintain the entire system without the benefit of absolute power.
He had to constantly balance, the competing interests of wealthy merchants, the military, the varying provinces, and all these external threats.
Exactly. He represents structured leadership under extreme constraint. He strengthened the Navy and supported trade expansion, trying to keep this highly decentralized machine running smoothly.
But the pressure was immense.
Oh, yeah. And his fate really highlights the vulnerability of that position. During a period of intense crisis, the public basically turned on him and he was violently killed by a mob.
Which is just a horrific end for someone trying to hold the whole system together.
It is.
But the figure who really caught my attention in this framework is Isaac Lemaire. He is labeled the internal critic.
Yes, Lemaire provides a crucial counter-perspective here. He wasn't a naval commander or a politician. He was actually a major early investor in the VOC.
He was one of the founders, right?
He was a founding shareholder. But he became deeply disillusioned with the company's centralized monopoly power and its massive internal corruption.
And he didn't just write an angry letter and complain, right? He actively used the financial system against them. The notes mention he engaged in early forms of short selling.
Yeah, he did.
Which, I barely understand short selling in modern stock markets. How on earth do you short sell a massive corporation in the early 1600s?
The mechanism was actually surprisingly similar to today.
Really?
Yeah. Lemaire realized the VOC was bloated and structurally flawed. So he and his associates essentially borrowed shares of the VOC, sold them on the market, hoping the price would drop due to the company's inefficiencies.
Because they knew the company was hiding bad news.
Right. With the plan to buy them back at a cheaper price, return the borrowed shares, and pocket the difference, he literally weaponized the financial markets to expose the weaknesses of the monopoly.
So he is this insider benefiting from the system who then turns around and attacks its very structure.
Yes. And the Kenny analysis views Lemaire as the evolved form of the system actor. He is moving beyond mere optimization and beginning to question the architecture itself. He's asking whether the system is actually fair, sustainable, or justifiable.
This analysis totally breaks the traditional way we look at history.
It really does.
I mean, the notes argue that the hero versus villain model just collapses here. If you try to force it, you might say Cohen is the villain, Hine is the hero, DeWitt is the tragic leader.
Right.
But Hine's quote-unquote heroic wealth came from a brutal imperial war. DeWitt upheld systems of massive colonial extraction. And even Lemaire, the critic, was fundamentally embedded in a system built on profit.
Exactly. Everyone is compromised.
So if a corporate structure financially incentivizes a manager like Cohen to secure a monopoly at any human cost, who bears the ultimate guilt? The manager who gives the order to fire, or the thousands of shareholders in Amsterdam demanding their annual dividend?
That is the pivotal ethical question of the entire analysis.
Yeah.
The framework suggests that the true villain is the system itself, a system that normalizes harm and mathematically rewards profit over ethics. It argues that individuals are rarely isolated moral actors. They are operators reacting to the incentives of the system they inhabit.
You really have to judge the whole picture. Individual choices, sure, but also the systemic incentives that rewarded domination, and the massive long-term consequences of who benefited versus who paid the ultimate price.
And those consequences rippled across the entire globe.
Yeah.
Because these decisions made in Amsterdam boardrooms, they violently collided with existing societies in ways that completely reshaped global geopolitics.
Let's look at that. How they actually crashed into the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Because the Dutch didn't invent global trade from scratch.
No, they didn't.
They didn't arrive at an empty ocean. They encountered incredibly complex existing networks, and their strategy was to essentially systematically dismantle and hijack them.
Yeah, their approach to the Portuguese is a prime example of this. The Portuguese had established a dominant maritime network in the Indian Ocean like a century earlier.
Okay.
The Dutch didn't try to build a parallel system. They surgically replaced the Portuguese. They used their superior ship design, specifically these heavily armed and highly efficient cargo ships called flickets.
Flutes, right.
Yeah, flutes. And they combined that with better corporate financing to systematically seize key Portuguese strongholds, like Malacca in 1641.
They were also fighting the Spanish globally as an extension of their war for independence back home, right?
Yes.
And they ended up fighting a series of intense naval wars against the Anglo-Dutch wars, battling over control of shipping lanes and just the right to dominate trade.
But it's interesting because their interactions with local non-European powers were defined by this ruthless conditional pragmatism.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, they rarely tried to conquer a powerful local kingdom outright. It was too expensive. Instead, they would form tactical alliances. They would partner with a local Indonesian sultanate or a Sri Lankan kingdom, offering military support against a rival in exchange for exclusive trade access.
Oh, wow. But the notes make it clear those alliances were almost always temporary and highly unequal.
It's very unequal.
They were just leverage points. As soon as the Dutch gained enough power in the region, the partnership would morph into outright domination.
Exactly. It was always about leverage. But the absolute most fascinating example of their pragmatism is their relationship with Japan.
Oh yeah, tell me about Japan.
During the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan implemented a policy of extreme isolationism. They basically expelled the Portuguese and the Spanish because the Iberian powers were heavily pushing Catholic conversion, which the shogunate viewed as a profound political threat.
Understandably so.
Right. But the Dutch were allowed to stay. They were the only Europeans permitted to trade with Japan for over 2 centuries.
And they were allowed to stay entirely because of their systemic mindset, right?
Yes.
The Dutch promised the shogunate that they had zero interest in spreading religion.
None at all.
They agreed to be confined to a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki harbor called Dejima. They accepted extreme restrictions, humiliation, constant surveillance, all because the profit margins of the Japanese trade were so spectacularly high.
It was pure, unadulterated commercial pragmatism.
I mean, we have this mental image of colonial empires just rolling in like a bulldozer, planting a flag, and declaring dominance. But the Dutch approach was, like, surgical.
It really was.
They analyzed the local system, found the point of maximum leverage, and applied exactly enough pressure to extract the wealth. It is almost sociopathic in its rationality.
That rationality created vastly different realities depending on where you were located within the system. The lived experience of this empire varied wildly.
Yeah, let's talk about that. If you lived in the Netherlands during this era, you were experiencing an economic and cultural golden age.
It was booming.
It was a dynamic, urban society where merchants, not aristocrats, held the power. You had a thriving middle class, incredible art, and, relative religious tolerance. It was a society powered by the wealth of global connectivity.
But if you shift your gaze to the colonies, the reality of the blueprint is incredibly grim.
Night and day.
Life was rigidly stratified by race, legal status, and proximity to VOC or WIC power. In a place like Suriname, you had an enslaved population subjected to horrifyingly brutal, coercive plantation labor to produce sugar.
Just a living nightmare.
It was. And in port cities like Batavia, you had highly controlled, multi-ethnic populations living under a strict legal hierarchy designed entirely to protect Dutch commercial interests.
And we also have to consider the massive floating population, too. The empire relied on thousands of sailors enduring months-long voyages.
Yeah, life at sea was not glamorous.
Not at all. The conditions on those ships were brutal. Rampant disease, incredibly strict discipline, constant danger. The empire was essentially a massive machine moving people and goods, and the gears of that machine were human lives.
You really see the ultimate symbol of their reach and the eventual limits of their model in North America.
Oh, New Netherland.
Right. They established New Netherland with its capital New Amsterdam at the southern tip of Manhattan. It was a thriving, diverse commercial hub.
But they lost it to the English in 1664. And New Amsterdam became New York.
Exactly. And losing New Amsterdam is a perfect transition point because it illustrates that even the most ruthlessly optimized, mathematically perfect system has a ceiling.
Right.
Eventually, the Dutch blueprint encountered a competitor that it simply could not outmanage or out-engineer.
Let's talk about the fall, the ceiling of efficiency. Because it's really important to note that the Dutch Empire didn't explode in one dramatic, cinematic collapse.
No, it wasn't destroyed overnight by a single event.
Right, it was a slow, systemic outcompeting. They were gradually overtaken by the British Empire. And examining why they failed offers a masterclass in the limitations of a purely trade-based network system.
The notes highlight several key vulnerabilities here. First, basic competition and scale. England, which obviously later became Great Britain, simply had a larger population.
Like you said, more people.
More people, yeah. They built a stronger, more robust navy, and crucially, they began the early stages of industrialization.
The Dutch model was undeniably brilliant, but it was fundamentally reliant on holding trade hubs and maintaining a minimal territorial footprint.
Right.
They controlled the flow of goods, but they didn't control the massive land masses required for immense population growth or large-scale industrial production.
It was a fatal over-reliance on the network itself.
Yeah.
Britain figured out how to iterate on the Dutch model. The British learned how to combine vast global trade networks with massive territorial control, as they eventually did in India.
Right.
Controlling trade routes was no longer enough when your rival controlled the routes, the territory, the population, and the manufacturing base.
And the machine was breaking down from the inside, too, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The VOC, this terrifyingly efficient corporate giant, eventually succumbed to its own scale.
It did.
It became bloated, incredibly corrupt, and slow to adapt. It essentially collapsed under its own weight and went bankrupt in the late 1700s.
Yeah.
The ultimate system failure.
The Kenny synthesis describes this beautifully. The notes categorize the Dutch Empire as a Phase 1 system.
A Phase 1 system. Okay.
Yeah. It was highly efficient, network-based, dominated by trade logistics, and driven by corporate entities. The British Empire that replaced it was a Phase 2 system.
I want to make sure I understand this clearly. The British didn't invent an entirely new concept.
No.
They just took the exact architectural blueprint the Dutch had drawn up, and they scaled it up with industrial capacity and territorial conquest.
So that's exactly it. They scaled the blueprint.
It feels incredibly analogous to the modern tech world.
Oh, how so?
It's like a brilliant startup that invents a revolutionary new software platform. They write the code, they prove the concept works, they dominate the early market,
Right.
but they refuse, or they physically lack the resources, to expand their server capacity.
Sure.
Then a massive rival company comes along, copies the exact same underlying code, but invests billions of dollars in physical infrastructure, server farms, and marketing, and just totally crushes the original startup.
That is a perfect analogy.
Being highly efficient in phase one doesn't guarantee you can survive the scaling required for phase two.
Exactly. They optimized the logistics of trade and built a truly global network, but they hit the physical and demographic ceiling of their specific systemic design.
Okay, let's bring this all back together for the listener.
Mm.
The Dutch Empire ultimately fell. Their geopolitical dominance faded. But the architectural blueprint they drew up, both its brilliant connectivity and its profound, chilling moral contradictions, that blueprint became the foundation of the world we live in right now.
It really did. The true legacy of this deep dive isn't about, memorizing the dates of naval battles or looking at old maps of Batavia.
Oh.
The legacy is deeply structural. The Dutch normalized the concept of global supply chains.
Ah.
They invented the multinational corporation acting as a political and economic force.
Yeah.
They demonstrated that complex order could be maintained across vast oceans.
Right.
But simultaneously, they provided a terrifying historical warning of what happens when a powerful structure operates entirely without a conscience.
We interact with the ghosts of this empire constantly.
Yeah.
We see it in the geopolitical formation of modern Indonesia. We see it in the enduring cultural connections in the Caribbean. We literally walk on its legacy in the street names of New York.
Exactly.
And we see it at the heart of the ongoing global debates over colonial restitution and historical memory.
The realization that maps, archival records, corporate ledgers, and logistics are not just administrative tools, but active instruments of power. That is a distinctly Dutch imperial innovation, and it basically governs the modern world.
Which leaves us with a final, somewhat uncomfortable thought to chew on. If you're listening to this, you interact with the legacy of the Dutch Empire every single time you track a package across the globe on your phone, or every time you log into a brokerage account to buy shares in a multinational corporation. If the modern corporate world is fundamentally running on the Phase 1 blueprint that the Dutch designed over 400 years ago, a system that inherently, mathematically prioritizes shareholder value, logistical efficiency, and supply chain monopolies above all else, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question.
We really do.
Have we actually upgraded the moral core of this operating system? Or have we just gotten much, much better at hiding the human costs in the paperwork? Because at the end of the day, someone still has to own the toll booths.